Good afternoon, and welcome to the Whitney Humanities Center. My name is Kajata Nieka. I have the pleasure of serving as director here. I am really pleased to welcome you to the final lecture of the Humanities Now series this academic year. We are particularly pleased to welcome our own Willie James Jennings from the School of Divinity to teach and move us to that. It's great to see, that part of campus coming to us, I think it will be transcendental, in this room in the next hour, and I am here for it. I hope none of your previous speakers are here, but this is indeed one of those rare cases where the expression saving the best for last might actually be closer to the condition of truth. Before turning the podium to Dr. Clifton Cranby, who will introduce our speaker, I just want to say a few words on the series. Humanities now takes seriously the responsibility to prioritize innovative approaches to humanities, especially those that break intellectual boundaries across disciplines, dismantle walls between the university and its broader communities, but most importantly, promote human flourishing. It supports work at the cutting edge of the intellectual questions and pragmatic concerns at the heart of what it means to be human in our contemporary world. The talks have been different and wide-ranging all year, from a discourse on black masculinity to a disposition on the museum and the project on decolonization to today's lecture. But what they share, I think, is the capacity of intellectual inquiry in the humanities to shed light, special light, on the problematics of the moment. Today's talk is no exception. As we begin, I remind you that the university is committed to free expression and peaceful dissent. Interfering with the speaker's ability to speak and the audience's ability to hear and see is not consistent with the university's free expression policy. Please hold your questions or comments until the end. Professor Jennings will generously take questions at the end of the lecture. And please remember the lessons of your English classes. Keep those questions concise so we can get to as many as possible before you all have to leave. That said, I am pleased to welcome to the podium Dr. Clifton Cranby, Associate Professor of Ethics, Philosophy, and Africana Studies at the Divinity School. He is the author of wide-ranging publications, I won't list them here, on ethics, climate and black ecology, and race and philosophy. And we're so delighted that he will be he'll be introducing to us, Professor Jennings. Welcome, Professor Cranby.
Good evening. I have the good fortune of introducing our distinguished speaker for this evening, Dr. Willie James Jennings, Associate Professor of Theology and Africana Studies at Yale Divinity School. Professor Jennings is the author of 3 marvelous books, scores of journal articles and book chapters, and numerous public-facing essays and sermons across a variety of media. In 2023, he delivered the prestigious Bampton Lectures at the University of Oxford. His first book, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, was published with Yale University Press and was widely celebrated as one of the most important contributions to the study of theology, race, and post-colonial theory in the last quarter century. The Christian Imagination won the American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence in the Constructive Reflective category and the Grawemeyer Award for Outstanding Work in the Field of Religion. Professor Jennings' other books were similarly field-shifting and genre-bending. His commentary on the Book of Acts is, in my view, one of the most imaginative and liberatory engagements with the biblical text that you'll ever find. It's wise, probing, and capacious, and unlike anything that has come before it in the genre. Professor Jennings has the uncanny ability to reach wide-ranging audiences, even while traversing unusual amounts of intellectual terrain. The difficulty of doing both tasks at the same time, given the demands of scholarly prose, is hard to overstate. His achievement is ongoing. Severe intellectual labor, quietly distilled into poetry. In a word, black elegance, on the page and in his person. Dr. Jennings' most recent book, After Whiteness and Education and Belonging, deepens many of the themes explored throughout his career: the power of place, geography, and space in the formation of our contemporary racial order, the role that universities, seminaries, and institutions of higher education play in shaping the sensibilities of students and faculty, pondering ways to inhabit our relationships with one another and with wider ecological life forms in more emotionally attuned and radically expansive ways. And finally, Professor Jennings invites us to wrestle deeply with what we are to make of those larger architectures of feeling, thought, and imagination that structure our sense of what is beautiful, just, and desirable, our sense of what is possible. For Professor Jennings, this is a question that merits attending to the disciplinary insights of anthropology, history, sociology, and post-colonial theory, but it principally means, and this is really important for him, it principally means taking theological discourse as a creative force in the shaping of such questions. My sense is that many of these themes will receive fresh attention in his forthcoming lecture, To Build a Sad Land: Coloniality, Racial Reasoning, and the Imagined Built Environment of Christian Zionism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Willie James Jennings.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a joy to be here. I want to thank Professor Granby, the brilliant Professor Granby, for that very kind and generous introduction. I also want to thank Kajitan Ahike and Diane Barrett Brown, the director and deputy director of the Whitney Humanities Center, for setting up this lecture, allowing me to be the last speaker in the series. And I want to thank them for the excellence with which they do everything. Would you join me in thanking them? It is a joy, an absolute joy, to work with them. The WHC has gone from strength to strength under their brilliant leadership. My friends, this afternoon I want to dedicate this lecture to a group of friends in Israel-Palestine. For the last 2 years, I, along with a number of other African-American scholars, have been meeting monthly on Zoom with a number of Palestinian Christians there in the land and sharing our lives, sharing our journey, sharing our struggle. And so I offer my thoughts this afternoon with them in mind. And so when they get a chance to see this lecture, I hope they'll know how much I love and appreciate them and their incredible courage. As I look out at the audience tonight, I want to thank many of the Divinity School students who came up the hill. Thank you so much for doing that. I very much appreciate it. And for colleagues who are here, thank you as well. And for friends from the community, so good to see you. I am honored always to be in your presence. In December of 1963, the great African-American mystic and theologian Howard Thurman finally fulfilled a dream and came to Israel. Thurman, the lover of Jewish people, the tireless crusader against anti-Semitism, and the holder of close friendships with several Jewish religious leaders, including Rabbi Joseph Glazer and Rabbi Zalman Schachter Salami, had longed to visit the Holy Land. After he got there, he said he never wanted to return. His exact words in his autobiography were, "I do not desire to see it again." Thurman arrived in Israel after visiting Nigeria, and while in Nigeria, delivering a eulogy for the assassinated president, John F. Kennedy, before a crowd of Nigerian officials, the American Diplomatic Corps, and many expatriates. Thurman like a multitude of other black intellectuals across the world, was not surprised that Kennedy's presidency had ended in bloodshed. Because this was the danger, he surmised, in confronting the racial horror of America and the Western world. Thurman had hoped that coming to Israel would have offered him some solace after both a taxing time in Nigeria and a taxing trip to the Holy Land. But what he found in this leg of his journey led him to a painful conclusion. His words in his journal were, "This is an unhappy land." Thurman gives slight suggestions for his sense of the sadness of the land. There was a lack of hospitality. There was unfriendly behavior. He seemed disturbed by how things were laid out geographically, if not geopolitically. But this evening, I want to speculate further on the source of that sadness. Possibly give voice to what Thurman sensed but did not capture in words. In this regard, I may be giving voice less to Thurman's sadness and more to my own at the geopolitical, geo-theological landscape of Israel and the Holy Land, a landscape facilitated by the long work of Christian Zionism. The historian Donald M. Lewis defines Christian Zionism as a Christian movement that holds to the belief that the Jewish people have a biblically mandated claim to their ancient homeland in the Middle East. The evangelical Lutheran church pastor Robert O. Smith, who was also the moderator of the Palestinian-Israeli Ecumenical Forum of the World Council of Churches, defines Christian Zionism as political action informed by specifically Christian commitments to promote and preserve Jewish control over the geographic area now comprising Israel and Palestine. But these are bare bone definitions that don't bring us to Thurman's sensing of a sad land. For that, we need a definition that brings us to a wider reality within which to situate Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism imagines God's love channeled through race and nation for Jewish people. It is an orientation of spatial desire that organizes life, land, and love, both human and divine, through a propertied and territorial vision of existence. Christian Zionism, as I will articulate it, is deeply intertwined with the dominant forms of habitation that shape the Western world. By forms of habitation, I mean both the ways we understand what it means to inhabit a place, to align embodiment and identity with habitation of land and building, and the ways we wish to design and build life and form our built environments. This evening, I want to consider the form of habitation engendered by Christian Zionism. That is, the way its conceptual architecture shapes spatial vision and sets the stage for distorted love through nationalist form. Christian Zionism helps to facilitate a form of mourning that it refuses to discern, that binds bodies and land to a shared sadness. My reflections this evening draw from the final chapter of my forthcoming book, Race, Theology, and the Built Environment. The thesis of that work is that the body, the building, and the work of design must be thought more closely into their braided existence to understand both the continuing colonial, racial, and geographic legacies we inhabit, and to address more holistically our environmental and political catastrophes. To think the body, the building, and design together bring us inevitably to the workings of the religious imagination, and more precisely, regarding the Western world, the workings of the theological imagination. Now, my friends, let me be clear. Every step I will take in and around the conceptual architecture of Christian Zionism touches wounds. Some old, some fresh as the morning sun, wide, deep, blood red, bright, and painful. They will be steps taken in the shadow of suffering, the sound of cries drenched in tears. We all in this room know the common refrain being spoken now at the sites of Jewish and Palestinian suffering. It is complicated. No doubt, no disrespect. Yet I want to draw us to the complexity out of which came our current complexities. And to do that drawing, we need what the modern university struggles to grasp, the theological. Theology matters, and to understand how it matters remains a mystification in too many quarters of the academy, shaped by fear, anger, indifference, and sheer ignorance of it. Now, friends, my comments are not aimed at shaming. No. But only to underscore the urgent need to peel back the layers of secularity that often cover intellectual practice to understand Christian Zionism. We cannot understand, nor should I say, appreciate this moment, this colonial moment, this racial moment, this nationalist moment without touching Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism forms a sojourn, an intellectual and spiritual pilgrimage that we must observe from its beginning to its imagined ending. It is a sojourn across the land. Indeed, understanding precisely what the land is and is not will bring us to the beating heart and thick heat of the Christian Zionist imagination. To help us think about what the land is and is not as we consider that imagination, I will draw on the wisdom of a few poets probably known to most people in this room. The Jewish poet Yehuda Amichai and the Palestinian poets Mahmoud Darwish and the hauntingly lyrical poet Najwan Darwish, of no relation to Mahmoud Darwish. Together they help us mark a landscape in mourning, shaped in sorrow and needing redemption. Yet they also raise for us profound theological questions. Could mourning help us think against nationalist form? Might there be a way of imagining collective existence coming out of mourning that redirects spatial desire and drains love from racial and nationalist form? But first, the question. Why does Christian Zionism exist? It exists because it is the deepest architecture of state-to-state relation between the U.S. and Israel. It exists because it is the most consequential formulation of the religious character of nationalism in the Western world. It exists because it schools the political imaginations of millions of Christians and non-Christians around the world, around how to think right relationship between a nation and God, or a nation and the common good. But most centrally, it exists because Christian desire exists. And Christian Zionism is a profound redirection of Christian desire. It forms in the desire present long before it comes to be, long before the emergence of the deeply harmful collectives that we will consider in a moment of race, nation, and religion. The Christians, the ancient Christians, believed that the Jewish Jesus they followed, who died and rose again, confirming that he was indeed Israel's Messiah and God in the flesh, would return. It is the desire of his return that begins it all. Between his leaving, in theological studies, we refer to this as his ascension, and then the sending of the Spirit of God to guide and direct all who would be willing to follow. Between his leaving and his return, there is the mission, the task of witness to the salvation this Jewish Jesus has made real in the world. And there is the suffering, especially for those early Christians: persecution, imprisonment, torture, violent death. They understood themselves to be living at the end of time itself, drenched in chaos. They stabilized themselves, however, held themselves up, as it were, by a word echoed among themselves: He will return. He will return. Words so massive that their gravitas draws heaven and earth, time and space, peoples, bodies, and especially land into its inescapable orbit. Yet what is most decisive for our consideration is another reality that the return of Jesus draws into its orbit: suffering. Suffering is bound inextricably to the hope of his return. It is not an answer to theodicies, to those perennial questions about why we suffer. With thinking the return, we are long past theodicies and into a way of seeing through suffering, turning suffering into a transparency that materializes a beyond. Now, before you quickly conclude that this is an absurdity, even an obscenity, that does not take suffering seriously, remember, it forms in the bodies of sufferers. It forms through the testimony, remember witness, the testimony of persecuted ones who had seen, touched, and held the wound-marked body of the risen Jesus, the embodied beyond. For our purposes, however, what must be understood is that suffering has a beyond in the minds of these Christians, and suffering may be rendered, maybe even dangerously, a transparency. Among the many texts that constitute the New Testament, there is one passage in the book of Revelation that captures so much of this beyond and was to become an essential textual backdrop for Christian Zionism. It is Revelation 20, 1 through 10. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and locked and sealed it over him, so that he would deceive the nations no more, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be let out for a little while. Then I saw Thrones and those seated on them were given authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their testimony to Jesus and for the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its brand on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. Wait, to make sure it's okay. The rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power. But they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years had ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, in order to gather them for battle. They are as numerous as the sands of the sea. They marched up over the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil, who had deceived them, was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were. And they will be tormented day and night forever. Now, my friends, we do not have the time nor the conceptual or emotional bandwidth to consider the history of interpretation of this ancient text, nor the nature of apocalyptic literature and thought, nor the modalities of allegory that flow through this text. We must note one phrase repeated 6 times in these verses, which I highlighted. 1,000 years, a millennium, from the Latin mille, meaning 1,000. The millennium is a temporal bubble in time that anticipates the beyond time. It brings the divine presence to its ultimate intensification. Jesus, the Son of God, is reigning here on earth. This is Christian desire take form and flight, opening toward multiple ways of imagining the 1,000 years in heaven and on earth. 2 millennialist trajectories begin to take flight in the early and later years of Christian thought. And by early and later, all historians present, please forgive me, I mean the first 1,500 years of Christianity, both calibrated to the return of Jesus. The first trajectory hoped for his return to be followed literally by 1,000 years. Let's call them ancient pre-millennialist in their hoping. Jesus would return before the millennium. The second trajectory also hoped for his return, but the time we are now in is the millennium, figuratively or allegorically speaking, as we now live in the reign of God in heaven and on earth through Jesus the Christ. There is no need to wait for a literal 1,000-year reign, because there will be none. Thusly, the second trajectory was designated millennialist, meaning no actual millennium. There is a third option embedded in this second trajectory, which meanders, if you will, between premillennialism and amillennialism. The third option hopes for the success of the witness, the spreading of the gospel, and the transformation of the world in Christian hope. The realization of that hope will usher the world into the divine presence. Christ will return to a world made ready for his return. And then there will be 1,000 years of peace with God through Jesus Christ. This third position of hope, can be designated as loosely post-millennialist. The point here is that the world can be transformed. The world can be made ready for the new. Now, dear friends, Dear friends, on this Thursday afternoon, I need not take you through a dizzying array of Christian thinkers and writers who line up along these trajectories. Some of you are whispering, thank God. Nor the difference without substance between millennialist and millenarian. What is crucial is that this is a Christian hope of a world inside a Christian reign that captures all peoples, especially Jewish peoples. Where are Jewish people in and during this reign? They are there, assimilated, or in the process of accepting this Jesus as their king. This is a Christian vision that forms century after century Christian perception of the world and people. But something else equally important is happening to Christian perception as these centuries unfold. They begin to imagine that they have become, in the eyes of Israel's God, the true people of God. Perception matters a lot. And as these centuries accumulate, a strange reversal occurs and locks in place. The earliest Christians were a question for Jewish people, especially Jewish followers of Jesus. What will we do with these goyim who believe in our God? Those who follow us, who follow Jesus. This Gentile belief is a question that reaches down to the bone of both Jewish and Gentile existence. To put it crudely, the Jewish subject thinking, perceiving the Gentile object. One more time. The Jewish subject thinking, perceiving the Gentile object. The direction of perception, however, flips. And soon Christians will start asking a strange, let's call it sick, question. What will we do with these Jews who do not believe in their God that we now know better than they do? The question will grow in its malignancy, layered with another question. What will God do with these Jews who do not believe? Let's stick with the crude to capture this mangled perception. The Christian subject thinking and perceiving the Jewish object. Again, the Christian subject thinking and perceiving the Jewish object. It is this layering of questions, friends, this layering of questions, the intertwining of them, Christian and God, that will bring the density of the perceiving, even the obsession of perceiving the Jewish object. This inversion of perception is central to what is called Supersessionism, the constellation of ideas and concepts that create the orientation for Christians that they have replaced Israel as the people of Israel's God. Now, we have not arrived at Christian Zionism, but we have arrived at the energy that drives hatred of Jewish people at the hands of Christians. And we have also arrived at the energy that will form Jewish people into a theological fetish, born of the question, what is to be done with them? To arrive at Christian Zionism, we must arrive at the colonial moment, beginning with the 16th century, and the developments that moved through and beyond the old world of the British Isles and what will later be called Europe, and into the colonies that bear the imprints of the colonial powers. Christian Zionism forms inside a colonial Christian imaginary, a colonial Christian imaginary that links history and land to the discernment of what God is doing in the world. And again, without inundating you with a dizzying array of names and movements. Let's think of this emergence in three layered moments. In the 16th and 17th century, that imaginary forms visions for the national conversion of Jews to Christianity that would take place in their homeland in Palestine. In the 18th century, that imaginary continues to form such visions, but now mediated through the place and purpose of Christian nations in facilitating Jewish salvation and restoration. In the 19th century, that imaginary will articulate the essential role of God, the essential role that God has designated for Christian nations for their own salvation and well-being in securing a homeland for Jewish people. In the 20th century, that imaginary will articulate salvation through nationalism, both in terms of securing the well-being of Jewish people and the well-being of all other nations in relation to Israel. With each century, what deepens, my friends, what deepens within Protestant piety is a strange kind of love for Israel through the idea of its restoration that aligns with a love for one's own nation. We even have the formation of what might be construed as a critique of supersessionism. But this critique is not calling into question that inverted Christian positionality I noted earlier. This critique calls into question the idea that Israel no longer has any role to play in the plan of God, even as the original people of God. Now, as a multitude of scholars have shown us, the colonial moment formed several crucial concepts that would become living elements in forming habitation for our current world. Yet the most important element for understanding Christian Zionism and the form of habitation it imagines within its visions and versions was the transformation of the land. To quote Bob Dylan, with a slight modification, the land is a-changing. That change can be captured by one word: possession. Possession. As I have noted in earlier work, the idea of possession transformed with the colonial moment. The world became possession in an absolute sense. Scholars as different as Clarence Glykin, William Cronin, Silvio Federici, Vine Deloria Jr., and so many others have pointed us toward the change born of the transformation of possession in the old world and in the new. So many peoples in the old world and the new worlds understood possession through continuum, connection, and overlap. This was, as I like to say, possession by. Possession within the logics of creaturely reciprocity and animist sensibilities by which the land, which includes water, plants, animals, the elements, seasons, speak to us and speak through us. This sense of possession meant being claimed by something before one might imagine making claim on something. Yet it is precisely the developments on what it means to make claim on something that render a different understanding of possession. The different sense of possession forming in the metropoles and the colonies grasp possession through break, separation, and most importantly, enclosure. This is possession of. This sense of possession meant making a claim on something as the prerequisite for thinking existence and thinking connection. There is no small difference between being claimed by and making a claim upon. Because between these two ways of imagining possession, One way of imagining habitation is being destroyed and another is being created. Between these two ways of imagining possession, the body, the building, and design would be configured differently. Between these two ways of imagining possession, the land moves from being animate and communicative, facilitating knowing, guiding identities through story and practice, and it becomes, as Stuart Eldon notes in his wonderful work, territorialized, demarcating sovereignty of a people or person all the way down to the body and into the sphere of something being created called the private. And the defining characteristic of property, sovereignty, down to the bone and the dirt. As I've argued elsewhere, defining and thereby creating a people racially is the other side of the coin of defining the land and thereby creating the land as property. Whether it be the land as territory, the territory of a people, or the land as the private claim of an individual. What else forms between these two ways of understanding possession, along with racial existence and reasoning, territoriality, and private property, are the crucial concepts of religion and nation. They form within modulations of the idea and practice of enclosure, which is, I admit to you all, much too clean a way of talking about all the realities bound up with colonial conquest and land seizure. Our concern here, however, is not to rehearse, please, all those realities, but to sense life within the logic of possession and what I call the affective and racial ecologies of land and body ownership. Central to the logic of possession and those ecologies is the axiom that the prerequisite to existence, to recognition, to thriving life is ownership, beginning with self-possession. We must note the options presented here in the colonial moment. Self-possession, or someone else will possess you. That is slavery. Land ownership and private property, or itinerant existence, maybe even homelessness. Territorial sovereignty, or life on the move, going from place to place, fragmented, dispersed existence, that is exile, diaspora. Now, we all here in this room have some sense of these developments, but for our purposes, I am focusing on the inversion of possession and what forms with it. There is first a new organization of attachment and love for land. Love for one's own land, OWN. Love for one's owned, OWNED, land. This is love woven through possession of. This is love that constitutes subjectivity inside ownership. But what also forms with this inversion is mourning. Mourning slavery, or homelessness, exile, or diaspora existence is not a new thing. But when it is coupled with this inversion of possession, it will signal something not quickly discerned. You can sense it in the tortured life and poetry of someone like John Clare. John Clare, the 18th century English poet who, like so many others, were traumatized by the 1807 Act of Enclosure that took away the commons vital for the survival of so many poor people. Clare, the ecological protest poet, as E.P. Thompson called him so brilliantly, sensed that something horrific was happening through enclosure that cut deeply through both the bodies of people and the land. This was mourning and distorted love formed side by side, where peoplehood and subjectivity will reform in the quest to secure sovereignty over land and bodies. That is the quest for nation rooted in territory. All right. We have now entered where Christian Zionism comes to life. Inside this quest, and we have also entered a theological articulation of love, inside nationalist form. To be clear, this love inside nationalist form means that God loves nations and their territories. God wants nations to love one another and respect their territories. And God is doing a new salvific thing in the world through the nation of Israel in its claiming of its territory for the sake of all nations. Christian Zionism then brought added layers to that braided question we noted earlier. What will God and we Christians do with Jewish people? But now that question was, what will God and we white Christian men do with Jewish people? What will God and we white Christian colonial nations do with Jewish people? These added layers announced the racial character of ownership that forms with Christian Zionism, that expressed powerfully those famous words of W.E.B. Du Bois in his essay, The Souls of White Folks. Whiteness is ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. What God is doing with Jewish people will, of course, involve what white Christian nations must do with them. The answer began with salvation. God will save Jewish people and do so by returning them to their holy land. Yet this is a return shaped in a refusal, the refusal of so many colonial nations, so many nation states, to admit Jewish people or to admit them in very limited numbers, unless they were assimilated, Christianized, and therefore no longer Jewish. Love of land here was bound to hatred of Jewish people. Of course, we're talking about Jewish people as object, not talking subjects. We are talking about Jewish people as theological and political fetish. By the 19th century, that braided question was producing a braided answer, one both theological and political. Christian Zionists imagined that they could discern how and when God would save Israel, and therefore could mark in history the beginning and ending of the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of their God through Jesus. The designation for these temporal map makers is dispensational millennialists. They came and yet come in multiple shapes and sizes. I will not start listing them. But their logic holds firm across different Protestant denominations and nationalities. God will restore Jewish people to the land of Israel as a nation, as a racial state. And this will mark the movement of God to bring history to its fulfillment. This braided answer also produced and yet produces a different way of reading Jewish people and Israel as a nation, as a racial state, and that is vicariously. Vicariously. A vicarious reading of biblical Israel is as ancient as Christianity itself. Vicar in Latin means substitute, or more precisely representative. A vicarious reading of Israel means that biblical Israel represents humanity in its totality, in its humanness. Christians and anyone with discerning eyes can see themselves in biblical Israel. Yet by the 20th century, Israel's vicarious reality carried an added density. The reality itself became braided. Biblical Israel yet represented humanity in its totality. But now added to that reading was also reading Jewish people in Israel, the nation state, as presenting the essential truths of civilization formed through something called the Judeo-Christian set of Judeo-Christian values, especially in the context of a threatening Arab world. Added to that reading was also Israel, the nation state, as a crucial node in the constant pivoting against threats to Western nations, especially the United States and England, from the Cold War to the ubiquitous and nebulous war on terror. These braided answers rendered Israel the nation state, if not Jewish people, as a theological and political palimpsest that demands reading every action of Israel, the nation state, with the same constant focus as if its statecraft was scriptural. This means analyzing and evaluating every state action in terms of its global and eternal significance. Christian Zionists, determined to read God's working through nationalist form, concluded that the way of aligning our lives to God's will is to support not only the founding, but also the thriving and expanding of Israel, the nation state. God would bless any nation that blessed Israel. Blessing in this regard expanded beyond Christianity and any particular theological commitments into a geopolitical vision of a rightly ordered world. Yet the blessing has always been woven with the hating, forming a braided vision of Jewish people with love woven in hate. This means that Christian Zionism does not form in a vacuum separated from the history of Jewish persecution and the long continuous history of relentless, virulent anti-Semitism and all the realities of the Holocaust. None of this is separated from the long, complex history of Jewish Zionism or its relation to Christian Zionism. But my concern here is with Christian Zionism's continuing power, my friends, to organize theological and political vision and to guide the way many people, Christian and non-Christian, envision the relation of people to land and thriving life. Now, I have left out a lot of details about the history of Christian Zionism, not because they are unimportant, but because our goal is to understand its conceptual architecture so that we might see its spatial desire. I have also not focused on founding or current Christian Zionists because, in fact, my friends, they really are less important than the fact that Christian Zionism is now much more a global orientation, especially among Christians that shape and educate theological and political vision. It is precisely vision rooted in distorted perception that generates love in nationalist form and that turns suffering into a transparency. That's what I want you to hear. It turns suffering into a transparency. It is vision that looks through suffering, particularly Palestinian suffering, to see a beyond colonialism, beyond war, beyond occupation, beyond displacement, beyond settlements, beyond aggressive gentrification, beyond violence and oppression. There is God establishing the future in the land through spatial desire. That transparency, however, cannot attend to the mourning it allows and the distorted love it propagates. It is a transparency of suffering that also cannot hear life in a wounded land, a suffering land that weaves the suffering of Palestinian and Jewish peoples. This brings me to the words of the poets I mentioned earlier, beginning with the poetry of Yehuda Amichai. It is because this celebrated Jewish poet and former soldier is rightly criticized for enacting what Taysir Abu Adeh calls aesthetic camouflage within the settler colonial gaze that his poetry is important for attending to the mourning even as it makes Palestinians invisible. Consider his two poems, The Place Where We Are Right, and It's Been a While Since They Asked. The place where we are right. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and love dig up the world like a mow, a plow. And a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. It's been a while since they asked. It's been a while since they asked who lives in between the houses, and who was he, the last of the last to speak, and who forgot his coat between these houses, and who was the one who stayed. Why didn't he flee? Among the blossomers a dead tree stands, dead tree. A long-standing error, a misunderstanding of yore, the edge of the land where an era begins to be for somebody else. A bit of stillness there. And the current events of body and hell. The reeds of the end, their spells of sway and soft. The wind passed on its way through that locale. And the serious dog saw the humans laugh. Amichai's brilliant use of irony, as our own Hanan Hever notes, functions with a relentless strategy to evade responsibility for the Nakba. Yet this supreme example of state generation poetry also touches a land itself in mourning, sharing in the silence of the Palestinians. Here we can begin to see the colonial effect of land transformed into territory, and the configuration of a spatial desire that generates enclosure and displacement. This is the inner logic of mangled love being formed for land within nationalism. Yet what becomes of land and people when nationalism itself functions like a profound source of environmental degradation? And people are forced to articulate their body's relation to land within a shared reality of harm. To grasp this phenomena, we need to turn to the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish. And two of his poems come to mind for me: A Shameful Land and A River Dies of Thirst. This is a confined land that we inhabit and that inhabits us. A confined land not big enough for a short meeting between a prophet and a general. If two cocks fight over a hen and their pride, the feathers fly off the walls. A confined land with no intimacy for a male and female dove to mate. A shameful land. A land yellow in summer, where the thorns carve notches in the surface of the rocks to pass the time, even if our poetry says the opposite and supplies it with anthologies of descriptions of paradise to satisfy the hunger for beautiful things. felt by those seeking to preserve their identity. We, narrators of documents, official and poetic, required to be produced spontaneously, know that the sky will never abandon its many works to give evidence. A confined land, and we love it, and believe it loves us, living or dead. We love it and know it is not big enough for brazen laughter or a nun's prayer or to hang washing out of reach of the neighbor's prying eyes. Not big enough for the 14th line of a translated sonnet. A confined land with no area big enough for a proper battle with an external enemy. And no hall large enough for people to meet in to construct an extensive preamble to a spurious peace. In spite of this, or because of this, people say that a discontented God chose it as a cave to retreat to, a place to hide from the uninvited guest who immediately stole our ram's horns and used them as weapons to keep us away from the door of the holy cave. A river dies of thirst. A river was here, and it had two banks, and a heavenly mother who nursed it on drops from the clouds. A small river, moving slowly, descending from the mountain peaks, visiting villages in tents like a charming, lively guest, bringing oleander trees and date palms to the valley, and laughing to the nocturnal revelers on its banks. Drink the milk of the clouds and water the horses and fly to Jerusalem and Damascus. Sometimes it sang heroically, at others passionately. It was a river with two banks, and a heavenly mother who nursed it on drops from the clouds. But they kidnapped its mother, so it ran short of water and died slowly of thirst. People and place, the land and Palestinians are one in these poetic offerings, and here we see an indigenous sensibility familiar to all who understand animist logics, where the world is full of persons, some of whom are human, to quote that famous Ojibwe saying. I am not suggesting that Darwish is consciously working with such logic and not possibly classic anthropomorphism, but his recognition of shared harm captures that which is hidden to the vision of Christian Zionism. A land in distorted perception when it is seen as territory to be established by war. This insight can also be found in the marvelous work of Najwan Darwish in his poems Like These Trees and To Lament a Mountain. And just because I love his poetry, I had to add a third, While Spring Falls. The trees are intent on swaying without falling, because here fallen trees are not taken in by the land, nor by anyone or anything. Yet since they could no longer bear the rotting of their roots, and since they choose to grow in the wind, they must pay the price and fall forever. So when you sway and stagger on the sidewalk, I hope you do not fall, because you too will fall forever. Go ahead and imagine trees swaying with you, and an air that welcomes your fall. You who live like the trees, without land, without roots. To Lament a Mountain. A man whose substance is impermanence can't lament a mountain, but I'll risk it and write a lament for you, I'll risk my impermanence. I'll risk the fact that you'll endure while my words crumble and decay. I have no tricks up my sleeve. This madness is common among my people. We were blown into exile, but we still think we're mountains. Mountains unmoved by the wind. And then, finally, while spring falls. Spring's disillusioned. The seasons stand on the edge and throw themselves off like a woman who can't take it anymore. Open your arms to her. Be as generous as the sea with the drowned. It never asks for addresses or names. The seasons stand on the edge while spring falls with no land to receive it. Najwan Darish brilliantly articulates a shared existence of paying land and paying people. Palestinians are the trees, they are the mountains, and they are the seasons waiting to receive thriving life on the land. It seems, those of you who are very observant and quick, which is everyone in the room, it seems that what I'm doing here is tracing what might be understood as the global melancholy of indigenous peoples trapped in displacement and exile, registering the intertwining of somatic and geographic tragedy and struggling against oppression that reaches down to the bone and the dirt, as I like to say. This is true, and certainly not new. But what I'm also doing is raising the crucial question about how we might begin to challenge the power of Christian Zionism. As I close, let me say this. To perceive it as simply religious ideology or political ideology, and then denounce it as only a tool of Western statecraft, is to not see how it teaches people to see. The challenge is to turn the transparency of Christian Zionism against itself, to see through the suffering, not only holy Zion restored in its territorial sovereignty, ready to announce the global reign of Israel's God, but to see through the suffering into the mind-bending suffering of Palestinians and the land. And to see Jewish people imprisoned inside a love woven in hate that objectifies a dream of global control born of colonial desire and white supremacy. How might we turn the gaze of Christian Zionism against itself in such a way as to make possible a rethinking of its distorted and distorting way of love, divine and human, bound to nationalism? Well, if nationalism is tied to territoriality, if nationalism, tied to territoriality, creates an exhausted and exhausting form of collectivity, which it does, then to think other options for life together must face the fear of architectural exhaustion. Who can design and build life together when the tools for designing and building have been stolen by nation states and broken into little pieces and hidden away in small cabinets stuffed with useless junk? We have then come to the work of gathering the fragments. No, more precisely, we have come to the work of stealing the fragments. Stealing the fragments that remain, that we might allow ourselves to begin weaving body, building, and designs against the nation state and territorial visions of existence, and towards something that might open toward the new, even something hoped for. There's another text I want to close with. There is another text that might be used to intervene against the optic of Christian Zionism. It comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verse 25 through 28. An expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." This text reveals the moment when we who are Gentile overhear the great Shema. This intra-Jewish conversation becomes for Christians and anyone else listening a blueprint for organizing the fragments that remain: trees, rocks, mountains, buildings, sidewalks, fields, stories, memories, hopes, dreams, bodies in pain and joy. People of other faiths trying to survive inside the territorial horror of the world. What would it mean to build life, neighborhoods, villages, towns, and cities with this blueprint? Love of self and love of neighbor so deeply intertwined that they cannot be separated. Such a lack of separation leaves no space for territorial or national vision to organize collective life. This, of course, is a dream as intense and hopeful as those ancient millennialist dreams. But it is one through which to organize our actions. And in this regard, and only in this regard, should anyone ever be a Zionist. Thank you very much. Now I will take a few questions, and in the words of the famous church mother, when people started talking, she would say, "Dear friend, dear saint of God, please be brief." And if you have a comment, as my dean likes to say, just camouflage it in the form of a question. But please, anyone.
Thank you, Professor Jennings. Can you speak a little bit more about poetry's capacity to weave us inextricably towards one another, and what other forms of art or art making might facilitate this kind of reconciliation?
That's a wonderful question. Would you like to tell folks your name and where you are?
Sure. I'm Alden Fawcett. I'm a first-year Master of Divinity student.
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. Well, as you can see, I think poetry allows us the space we need to breathe into the depths of our existence. And poetry in that regard, for me, makes possible what often cannot be said. And it makes it possible in a way that allows courage to be formed precisely in the saying. And in that regard, I think there are many other art forms that do this. But what I like so much about poetry is that it often walks on the terrain of the illegal, the what's not permitted to be said in discourse, the connections that are often refused to be made because they can't be proven, and the things that need to be said, but only those who are desperate and are near the sound of death would dare say them. But what's also the case is that poetry also opens up the possibility of seeing what is not as though it were, to quote a little bit of Bible. And so I'm thankful for what poetry does. I have all my life loved poetry, but in the academy, unless you were over in the side of the academy that allowed poetry and literature, you were told to hide that. But I'm so glad that at this point in my life that I can let that live and breathe. Thank you for that great question.
Thank you, Professor. It strikes me that one of the powerful things about Christian Zionism that it is an eschatology, it is a vision of the end. Could you speak about your own understanding of eschatology as relates to this alternative form of building that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And please tell folks who you are.
I'm Sam Ernest. Hi.
And what do you do, Sam?
I'm a doctoral student in theology.
That was a wonderful question. Yeah, this is a great question. So, Christian Zionism is fully inside what those of you who are outside of the theological world, the Christian world, would call eschatology, which is a set of teachings we call doctrines around the end of all things, from the word eschaton, which means last things. So, eschatology is about the study, the thought, the imagination of that. Well, here's what's so important about Christian Zionism and what's important about the topic of eschatology. It is about the place where imagination and what we believe is revelation meet and dance. They dance together. And so it's where we understand that God has given permission to dream the future, to dream what is possible. And so Christian Zionism isn't wrong in dreaming the future. It isn't wrong in dreaming what's possible. It isn't wrong in hoping what God will do in the world. Where it's wrong is that it's already provided the means by which God will do that. And it's been provided by the colonialist vision and imagination, which has filled in the blanks, filled in the blanks that are a part of the imagination of what God might do, what God might create, what might happen in a world that we want to see beyond suffering. So one other thing that's important about Christian Zionism that we want to keep in mind, it is right and appropriate in the face of suffering to see a beyond. It's important to see a beyond. Now, of course, there is the problem in Christian thought that beyond can sometimes function like a drug that denies, that deadens the pain of the present. So that is always there. But we shouldn't fault Christian Zionism for that important strategic work of living to see a beyond. So what do I want? I want to imagine a beyond, but I want the blanks back. I want the blanks back. I want to take all the places where colonialism, where nationalism, where the possibilities of thinking life that is rooted in territory, taken off the table. Give me those blanks back. And if I can have those blanks back, to start to envision the possibility of building differently. But of course, soon to be Dr. Sam, that's the challenge, isn't it? The challenge is they don't want to give you the blanks back. But we need the blanks back. And if we have the blanks back, then we can start to think the way the imagination can do political work, the way the imagination can help sustain people in the midst of the absurdity of war and violence and the unbelievable pull of nation states at us. As I told my students in a class, in our basic theology class last week, one of the things about the nation state is that it makes you a promise and it asks you to accept them. What's the promise? I will keep you safe. Would you like that? And everyone says yes. And then the nation state says, good, now give me your children. Give me your life. You said you want to be safe. I want to take that back. I don't want to answer them. Would you like to be safe? I want to say, that's none of your business. Next question. Thank you, Dr. Sam.
Dr. Jennings, my name is Robert O. Smith. I'm a professor of history at University of North
I quoted
Texas.
I quoted you. Yeah.
You did, and
And I appreciate your edited volume. It was very helpful.
Well, thank you.
So
Thank
some
you.
of the essays, anyway. That's
All right.
That's another time.
Well, it's such a pleasure. We happen to be in Connecticut to talk about critical race theory, but
Really?
we were with Connie Royster today
Oh,
on a tour
wonderful.
at Yale Divinity
You
School.
were with the right person. Oh my God, she's royalty. Oh, go ahead.
So my question is, you emphasize the fetishization of Jewish existence by Christian Zionism. We see that, of course, emerging in the 16th century, really operationalized in the 17th century, but it's a fetishization of Jewish existence over and against a perceived enemy of Islam. And so in your talk, you didn't talk so much about the relationship with Islam.
Right.
I think of this as an Abrahamic problem that Christian Zionism makes a problematic interjection into those relations. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about Islamophobia and the function of Christian Zionism in relation to our relationships with Muslim siblings.
That's a great question, and that is true. That is another energy driving this. The reason I did not, kind of a little justification for why I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about Islamophobia and the formation of the Arab as threat, because that opens up a huge matter to think about that oftentimes will inadvertently take Christian Zionism off the hook. And I don't want to take it off the hook by saying that it is the emergence of the struggle between the Abrahamic religions. I'm not saying you're saying that exactly, but that tends the way the trajectory will work itself out. But it clearly is a part of it. The interesting thing, though, here that I wanted to highlight, and as you saw from the talk, I want to bring to the surface the mangled form of love. And often you can't get at that once you start to talk about the way hate for Islam forms. You lose sight of what's also forming. It's this mangled form of love that gets buried deep inside Protestant piety. So that to criticize the nation state of Israel, that as one, I won't name who it is, as one Christian Zionist said, it's like you are cutting at my very soul by your criticisms, because it has moved to a place of deep piety. And that, we have to get our minds around that, because we can't challenge it unless we understand the way it works inside piety and the formation of a Christian. And let's also remember that it is now a global phenomenon. There are people in places that you would not have imagined who are stark Christian Zionists, who have really no reason to be. But this is obviously, especially as we think about the invisibility of Palestinians and the hatred of Islam and Arabs, a fundamental part of the way in which that love functions in the world. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for being here. That's a great question. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Jennings. Thank you for that. I was struck by your switching of the language from gathering the fragments to stealing the fragments.
Yes, you caught that. You caught that.
Yeah, and I was curious about, particularly as we think about theft in the colonial moment as related to land theft, what work that switch is doing for you. Why are we stealing the fragments? And what did you mean by that? I wonder if you could unpack that.
Great. And tell folks who you are.
I'm Michael, first-year doctoral student here.
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. Well, I use the language of stealing because I want to imagine a different form of governmentality that we might create that doesn't necessarily tie us automatically into the logics of the nation state. Can there be other forms of governmentality, other ways of building the possibility of and function of life together that doesn't mean we commit to the nation state, which means we do not commit to war. We do not commit to violence. We do not commit to safety in that way. So that's, in point of fact, why stealing has to be imagined, because for so many of us, shaped especially in the Western Academy, it's come as a part of our formation that to imagine proper governmentality is to already commit yourself to the nation state and its ways of being. So I want to imagine something different. Of course, this is the hard work that so many indigenous peoples around the world are inside of. Can you imagine something different when the resources are being constantly drained from you? Can you imagine something different when increasingly the illegibility of something different is being pressed upon you? Can you imagine something different when increasingly the forms of education that your young people are being placed inside of draw them more and more to that being the only form of legibility that can possibly work in our community? So, yeah, that's a fight. But that's exactly where we have to take a lesson from Christian Zionism. They think the be not as though it were. Why can't we do the same?
So we'll take a few questions together, and those will be the last because of time. So I see one. Wow. Okay. I see one hand there. Yeah. And okay, second one, and maybe a third one here. I saw it. Yeah, I saw a third hand there. Yeah.
This is, I think, quite linked to what has been being talked about. I'll start by saying what is with me in all of this and my relation into thinking about this is being a military child and being ethnically Korean. Mm-hmm. And these are things that saying out loud are very loaded things. And I've been thinking about how the way that Korean subjectivity is construed, so that when I say this, I am rendered as a subject of war. Is there a way of thinking about and perceiving Korea that is not based in this militarized history of what has come to be the Korean subject? And that is whether or not people realize that is spectral to and active in these conversations and in the way I am seen and the way others are seen. And just going back to thinking about rejecting the allure of safety of the nation state, and also poetry as a way to live into what is not as though it were. How do you live into being what you are not as though you were, as though you are? Because this is something I believe, something I am doing, something I do. Can I articulate that? No, but I am doing it. So I would just love to hear that from you as well.
Thank you. And tell us your name, please.
And I'm Karis. I'm a doctoral student here in American Religious History.
So cool.
Take a second one here. And then,
Hi, I'm Sienna Dumal. I'm a first-year master's student at the Divinity School. And my question is also about stealing fragments. I'm curious about how to think through stealing our fragments back when we are embroiled in institutions that are giving us degrees or funding our paychecks that are involved in creating fragments and fragmenting our lives.
Wonderful question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. So my question deals with kind of clinging to things that don't truly serve us. So when thinking about Christian Zionism, the conflation between biblical Israel with the modern day state of Israel, even amongst communities that are very much learned enough to know better. And then a second conflation between linking anti-Zionism with being anti-Semitic. And I've encountered both of those two things I listed since I began my time here in August. My question is, do you think for those two conflations, do Christian Zionists cling so tightly to that? Because if we were to really stand 10 toes down as Christians on being fundamentally against imperial colonialism, we might have to deeply reckon with the complicity of the Christian faith with other forms of land theft and subjugation as it relates to enslaved peoples, who built up our nation with no pay on land that we stole from indigenous peoples.
And tell us your name and where you are.
Like Alden and Sienna, I am a first-year Master's of Divinity student at YDS and also a Berkeley seminarian pursuing ordination with the Episcopal Diocese.
And your name?
Elisha McAllister.
Thank you. So thank you for those three wonderful questions. Let me take the first two because they kind of talk to each other, and then I'll come to this wonderful third question. So, I had a student who wants to do a dissertation on Underwood, kind of one of the major founding figures, missionary founding figures of the nation of Korea. And Underwood's, when you read his journals and look at his life, he saw the possibilities of a new Korea. And he spent his whole life trying to, as you probably know the story very well, trying to capture an entire nation in his imagination. And as many historians have said, he succeeded. And what's so powerful about the Underwood story, powerful, both horrifically powerful and incredibly and importantly powerful, is that he understood the way in which imagination can create a collectivity, can create kind of a community that will think differently. And so part of the challenge, I think, to both of your questions is to think about the need for the echo, the need to be able to hear your hope shared with others. That's always the challenge. To be able to find the people who share with you the desire to live, to use Gramsci's own language, to live the counter-hegemonic. And to recognize, as Gramsci taught so beautifully, that you can do different stuff with what they give you. That being present in institutional realities does not mean that you have to allow institutional realities to guide you, that you actually can do different stuff. Now, of course, as we learn from the life of Gramsci, there's a price to be paid for that. But it is possible to do something different. So I do think at the end of the day, one can imagine, even in constrained places, doing something different with what you've been given. Because in many ways, that's why you're at a place like Yale, even though Yale won't allow too much wiggle room for doing anything different. But there are possibilities. There are possibilities. Yeah, this wonderful question that was asked about colonial settlerism and the difficulty of how to articulate this as a problem. We all face this. And here I want to underscore what's so difficult for us to imagine, and that is how to think life in the land without a territorial vision. Now, there is one thing that's happening that has promise for us, but we have not figured out what to do with it yet. And a number of indigenous intellectuals are trying to help us. Everybody now does these land acknowledgments at the beginning of everything, which I love. But, it's, as many people have critiqued it, so I don't have to repeat. But, as someone who also tries to do proper land acknowledgments, I always end my land acknowledgement by saying, and I always say, the usuals, the unceded land of this or that people wherever I go. And I talk about the unceded lands here, the Algonquin-speaking peoples. And then I always say, and I want to be a part of whatever efforts are possible to give the land back. I was in Denver and I did that. And people looked at me like, okay, when is he going to leave? Because there are active groups in Denver trying to, and so I did not realize that they were so active. And so, but now that's important, isn't it? Because all of a sudden, it's no longer history at that moment. It's an actual possibility. And we need to inhabit that possibility. More than that, we need to actually be a part of political efforts to make the possibility a reality. And one person in the audience said to me, well, he wanted to say it in private, so he finally did when we were in private actually said, well, are you going to be the first to give your home back? Are you going to give your home back first? I said, I would if I owned it, but I don't own it. The bank does. But it would be nice if there was a way to make the bank give it back. He walked away. So that was his last word, but it certainly isn't my last word. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here.